Close your eyes with me. Tonight, I want you to imagine something strange. Imagine that you fall asleep here, tonight in your own bed, and you wake somewhere else entirely. Not in another country, in another century. You open your eyes, and the year is somewhere in the 1870s. There is a coal fire breathing softly in the grate, heavy curtains the color of old wine, and the faint smell of beeswax and lavender water hanging in the cool morning air. And you are not yourself anymore. You are a lady, a real Victorian lady, with a great house around you, and servants below you, and a name that opens doors all over London. Everyone you will meet today believes you are the luckiest woman alive. The silk, the jewels, the carriages, the endless golden idleness. And here is the strange thing, the thing I want you to carry with you as you drift off tonight. You would not last a single day, not because you aren't clever enough or graceful enough, but because almost everything you know how to do, speaking your mind, moving freely, eating when you're hungry, simply being alone for an hour, almost all of it would be forbidden or impossible or quietly scandalous. The life looks like a dream from the outside. From the inside, it is a cage lined with velvet, and by noon, you would be quietly losing your mind. So that is our story tonight. Not a tragedy, just a long, slow, gentle walk through one single day in that gilded cage. Every rule you'd break without meaning to, every small freedom you'd reach for and not find. It's the kind of story that's far more restful to listen to than it ever was to live. If this is your first time here, welcome. I make these long, rambling history stories for people who want something calm to fall asleep to. If that sounds like your thing, maybe hit subscribe. No pressure though, and drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight. Is it late where you are? Is it raining? I always like to imagine where all these quiet voices are scattered across the world. All right, let yourself sink a little deeper into wherever you're resting. Slow your breathing, let your shoulders drop, and let's step together, gently, into a morning that begins long before you are ready for it. The first thing you'd get wrong is the waking itself. In your own life, you wake when your body decides, or when an alarm drags you up, and the first hour belongs to you and no one else. Here, that hour does not exist. You don't wake alone. That's the very first thing you'd have to understand, and the first thing your modern self would quietly hate. It begins with a soft knock, and then the door opens without waiting for an answer, because the person on the other side is not a guest in your privacy. She has no idea you imagine such a thing as privacy. She is your lady's maid, and she has been awake for 2 hours already, with hands cold from the morning, and a candle if the light is still thin. She crosses the room, draws back those heavy curtains, and rakes the dead coals in the grate to wake the fire. The room is still cool. The floor, if your foot found it, would be cold as river stone. But your foot will not find it yet, because rising on your own is simply not how this is done. Here's a mainstream fact that surprises almost everyone. A lady of this class was, in a very real sense, dressed by someone else every morning of her adult life. Not as a treat, as a structural necessity. We'll get to exactly why in a moment, but hold on to it. The clothing of a respectable Victorian woman was deliberately, almost ingeniously, impossible to put on by yourself. The helplessness was built into the seams. And here's a quirky tidbit that says everything about this world. Many great houses ran on a kind of invisible clock, and the maids learned to move through the family's rooms like ghosts, laying fires, carrying water, emptying basins, ideally without ever being seen doing it. The ideal servant was one you never noticed. So your morning would be shaped completely by the labor of a person you were trained, very gently, not to truly look at. You might not even know her surname. You might not know where in the house she slept, up under the cold roof in a room you'd never once visited. Some historians argue that this arrangement made these women genuinely helpless, that a lady raised this way truly could not function alone. Others suggest it was less about real incapacity and more about display, that being unable to dress or wake or wash without assistance was itself a luxury, a way of wearing your wealth on your own body. The truth, as it so often does, probably lies somewhere between the two. You were not helpless because you were weak. You were made helpless on purpose, because helplessness here was the costume of the rich. You lie still a moment longer in the warming room, listening to the small sounds of someone working quietly so that your day can begin. And already, before your feet have even touched the floor, you have lost the thing you didn't know you treasured. You are not in charge of your own morning. You never will be again. Now you have to get up. And this is where honestly you'd start to panic, because the next thing that happens is the corset. And no amount of reading about it prepares the body for the reality of it. You stand in your chemise, a soft, plain shift of linen or cotton, the only loose thing you'll wear all day, and your maid lifts the stays and fits them around you, and then she begins to pull. You feel it close around your ribs like a second skeleton, one made of cloth and bone and steel. The laces draw the two edges together up your back, snug, and then snugger, and the breath you're used to taking, the deep, easy, all-the-way down breath, that breath is simply no longer available to you. You learn within minutes to breathe high and shallow, up in the top of your chest, in small sips. Your whole posture changes. You cannot slouch. You cannot fully bend at the waist. To pick something up off the floor, you would have to lower yourself straight down, like a column sinking, knees together, back rigid. Here's a mainstream fact, and it's worth saying clearly because so much nonsense gets told about it. The popular image, women lacing themselves down to impossibly tiny waists and fainting and even having ribs removed, is mostly exaggeration and later myth. For the great majority of women, the corset was firm but not torture. It was foundational underwear, worn from girlhood, and most wore it snug rather than crushing. And this is the part your modern body would feel instantly. Even a normal, sensible corset reshapes how you move, how deeply you breathe, how long you can stand, how you sit, how you climb stairs. It is a constant, quiet, all-day pressure that you would never, ever forget you were wearing. Here's a quirky tidbit. Doctors of the age argued about the corset endlessly, the way every age argues about whatever it's decided is bad for you. Some physicians warned it weakened the muscles and crowded the organs. Others insisted a woman's frame actually required the support, that without it she might somehow collapse. Whole pamphlets were written, whole reputations were staked on the question of a strip of laced cloth. Some historians argue the corset was a genuine instrument of control, a way of literally constraining women's bodies and breath. Others suggest women themselves embraced it, that it offered support, warmth, a sense of being properly held together, of being correct, and that to read it only as oppression is to ignore the women who chose it freely. The truth probably lies somewhere between. It was both, a comfort and a cage, something you were laced into, and something you would have felt undressed and improper without. And there it is, the theme of your whole day arriving early, wrapped around your ribs. You can breathe, you just can't breathe deeply. You can move, you just can't move freely. Everything in this life will turn out to work exactly like this corset. Beautiful, supportive, suffocating, and almost impossible to take off by yourself. The fire is up now, the room is warm, and you are, quite literally, laced into your day. If the corset is where you'd panic, the rest of the dressing is where you'd simply give up. Because the corset is only the beginning. Over the chemise and the stays come the drawers, and then the petticoats, not one but several, layered for warmth and shape and modesty. Then, depending on the year, a structure to hold the skirts away from your body. In the earlier part of this age, a great domed cage of crinoline, light steel hoops that made your skirts swing out like a bell. Later, the bustle, a framework at the back that pushed the fabric up and out behind you in a cascade. And over all of that, finally the dress itself, which may have come in two pieces, a bodice and a skirt, fastened with a long row of tiny buttons or hooks running up the back, placed exactly where your own hands cannot reach. That last detail is not an accident, and once you notice it, you can't stop noticing it. The fastenings are at the back on purpose. The whole architecture assumes another pair of hands. You could no more dress yourself, fully and correctly, than you could lace your own spine. Here's a mainstream fact to hold the scale of it. A fully dressed lady might be wearing many separate garments at once, layer on layer, and the whole ensemble could weigh a genuinely surprising amount. Pounds of fabric, gathered and draped and trained behind you. In summer it was stifling. Walking, sitting, turning in a doorway, managing a long skirt on a staircase. Every ordinary movement became a small calculation. You would spend the day quietly, constantly, managing cloth. Here's a quirky tidbit that has a dark little edge to it. The great cage crinolines could be genuinely dangerous. Because they held the skirt so far from the legs, they brushed against fireplaces and candles and lamps, and there were real, documented tragedies of dresses catching fire. There were also more comic hazards, gusts of wind, narrow doorways, the sheer difficulty of sitting down gracefully in what amounted to a wearable tent. Real life made it a logistics problem. Some historians argue these elaborate layers were a kind of conspicuous uselessness, that the whole point was to advertise that you were a woman who did no physical work, who need never move quickly or freely, whose very clothing announced a life of leisure. Others suggest the layers were also about warmth in cold, drafty houses, about modesty, about the simple momentum of fashion, women dressing as their mothers and friends dressed. The truth probably lies somewhere between. Your clothes were a status symbol you wore on your skin, and also just what everyone wore. By now your maid has been working over you for the better part of an hour. You are warm. You are magnificent. You are also, in a way you'd feel in every joint, slightly imprisoned. You have not chosen a single thing you are wearing for comfort. You have chosen all of it. Or rather, it has been chosen for you, to be seen. And being seen, you're about to learn, is the entire job. Dressed at last, you turn toward the looking glass, and here is where your modern self would make the first truly dangerous mistake. You would relax your face. You'd let your shoulders go. You'd make some small joke. You'd laugh, perhaps, too loudly, or sigh, or roll your eyes at the absurdity of being sewn into a tent before breakfast. And every one of those small human things would mark you instantly as not quite a lady. Because the face you wear here is not your own. It is a mask, and you are expected to wear it from the moment you leave this room until the moment you return to it at night. The mask is called composure, serenity, a pleasant, untroubled stillness, whatever is happening behind it. You may feel bored to the edge of madness, furious, grief-stricken, in physical pain from the stays, and none of it may show. A lady does not grimace. A lady does not weep in company. A lady does not laugh from the belly. She smiles, gently, and if something is truly funny, she may allow a soft, contained amusement, like light on water. Here's a mainstream fact that runs underneath this whole world. Respectability for a woman of this class was performed every waking minute through the body, through posture, through the lowered voice, through the controlled face, through 100 tiny rules about how one sat and stood and entered a room. Your worth was not measured only by what you did. It was measured constantly by how perfectly you appeared. A single unguarded moment, witnessed by the wrong person, could become gossip that followed you for years. Here's a quirky tidbit. There were genuine manuals for this. Etiquette books, conduct books, columns in ladies' magazines that instructed women in the smallest details. How to hold the head, how long to hold the gaze, how to receive a compliment without seeming pleased by it, how to disagree without ever appearing to disagree. An entire literature existed to teach women how to perform effortlessness, which is, when you think about it, one of the most exhausting things a person can be asked to do. Some historians argue this culture of composure was a profound form of repression, that women were trained, essentially, to perform their own silence, to swallow every strong feeling until it had nowhere to go but inward, into the famous nerves of the age. Others suggest these same skills were a kind of power, that mastering the mask gave a clever woman enormous social influence, the ability to wound or bless with a glance, to rule a drawing room while saying almost nothing at all. The truth probably lies somewhere between. The mask was a prison. The mask was also a weapon, and you would have to learn to wear it before you'd had so much as a cup of tea. In the glass, a soft, still, pleasant face. Already it aches a little, this holding. Already you understand that you will be performing all day for an audience that never quite goes home. You go down to breakfast, and you are immediately, quietly, in danger. Not from anything dramatic, from the table itself, from the silver, the china, the small army of utensils, the unspoken laws of how a meal is taken. Because here is a thing nobody warns the time traveler about. Every single object in front of you has a correct use, a correct hand, a correct order, and getting any of it wrong is a small, visible confession that you do not truly belong. The room is warm and smells of toast and coffee and the faint coal smoke that scents this entire century. There may be covered silver dishes on the sideboard, kept warm, eggs, kippers, kidneys, cold meats, that famously enormous spread the well-off took in the morning. You serve yourself, or are served, and then you sit, spine straight, corset holding you upright, whether you like it or not, and you begin the careful performance of eating like a lady. Here's a mainstream fact. Table manners in this world were astonishingly elaborate and treated as a near moral matter. Which fork, which spoon, how to hold them, how to break bread rather than cut it, how never to overfill the mouth or make a sound, how to tilt the soup bowl away from you, not toward. All of it was drilled into children of this class from the nursery. To a person raised inside it, your modern habits would look not just clumsy, but almost shocking, like watching an adult who had never learned to use a door. Here's a quirky tidbit that would catch you out within the hour. There were rules about appetite itself. A lady was not supposed to appear hungry or greedy or too interested in her food. To eat heartily, with obvious enjoyment, especially in mixed company, was faintly improper. Some young women learned to eat a little before going out so they could pick daintily at their plates in public and seem to live on air. You, arriving from a century that posts photographs of its dinners, would commit a dozen small sins before the coffee was poured. Some historians argue these endless rules were really about exclusion, a constant shifting test that kept outsiders out, that let old money instantly recognize new money by its slightly wrong grip on a fish fork. Others suggest manners genuinely smooth social life, that shared rules let strangers dine together without friction, that the elaborate code was a kind of grace. The truth probably lies somewhere between. The table was a minefield and a dance at the same time, and you would step on every mine before you learned the steps. But you would learn. That's the thing about this day. Hour by hour, you'd start to feel the shape of the cage, and you'd start, despite yourself, to move within it more carefully. You finish your careful, dainty, unsatisfying breakfast. Somewhere a clock chimes. The morning's real work, which is to say, the morning's elaborate nothing, is about to begin. After breakfast comes the morning room and the correspondence, and your first encounter with a system so strange and so precise that you would never, in a single day, hope to master it. The morning room is the lady's domain, a smaller, warmer, more private room where the business of running a great household and a great social life is conducted. There is a writing desk, and paper, and ink, and almost certainly a small silver tray that has been brought to you, bearing the cards of everyone who called yesterday while you were out. And here your modern self meets the calling card, and the entire invisible architecture built around it. You see, you do not simply visit people in this world. You do not text, you do not telephone, you do not drop by. You leave cards. Small engraved rectangles bearing your name, and the leaving of them is governed by rules so intricate that whole pages of etiquette books are devoted to them. Here's a mainstream fact that genuinely organized upper-class social life. The calling card was the operating system of Victorian society. When you wished to begin or maintain an acquaintance, you called at the proper hour and left your card. The corner you turned down, the way you left it, whether you asked if the lady was at home, all of it carried meaning. A returned card meant the acquaintance was welcome. A card returned in an envelope rather than in person was a polite, unmistakable freeze, a closing of the door. Entire relationships were begun, sustained, and quietly ended without a single honest word being spoken aloud. Here's a quirky tidbit. There was a language to the cards themselves. Turning down one corner might signify you had called in person rather than sending a servant. Particular folds could mean condolence, congratulation, a farewell before leaving town. To the initiated, a tray of cards was a page of news, instantly legible. To you, it would be a tray of small white mysteries. You would hand back the wrong card in the wrong way to the wrong person, and somewhere a lady would arch one eyebrow and decide something about you that you'd never even know had been decided. Some historians argue this card system was a tool of ruthless social control, a way of policing exactly who was allowed into one circle, of including and excluding with surgical, deniable precision. Others suggest it was simply a practical solution to a real problem, how a small, busy elite managed an overwhelming web of acquaintance in a great city before any of our modern shortcuts existed. The truth probably lies somewhere between. It was bureaucracy and it was warfare, conducted entirely in engraved script on little cards, and you would lose, gently, all morning. The clock ticks, the fire settles, you hold a small white card in your gloved hand, and have truly no idea what to do with it. And the morning is only beginning to fill. Here is the rule that would undo you faster than the corset, faster than the forks, faster than the cards. You are never alone. Not now, not later, not in any real sense ever. In your own life, solitude is ordinary. You close a door, you walk somewhere by yourself, you sit alone with your thoughts, and no one finds it strange. Strip that away completely, and you begin to understand the particular airlessness of this life. A respectable young lady did not go out alone. She did not walk in the street unaccompanied. She did not receive a man alone, or travel alone, or, in many households, even sit in a room with a male visitor without a third person present. Her reputation, which was brutally her entire future, depended on her almost never being unobserved. So you would move through your day trailing a companion, a chaperone if you are unmarried, a mother, an aunt, a married friend, a paid companion, someone whose entire function is to be present, to watch, to make sure that nothing happens, and just as importantly, that nothing appears to have happened. A maid when you go out shopping, servants in the house who see everything. You are watched with affection, watched with duty, watched with idle curiosity, but always, always watched. Here's a mainstream fact that explains the whole strange machine. A woman's reputation was a kind of property, and not only her own, it belonged to her family. It set the price of her on the marriage market. It could be damaged beyond repair by a rumor that need not even be true. So the chaperone was not really there to protect the young woman from danger. She was there to protect the appearance of the young woman, to be a living witness that the rules had been kept. Innocence had to be not just real, but provable. Here's a quirky tidbit. This created a strange, suffocating intimacy with one's own watchers. A girl might spend years, almost never out of sight of her mother or her chaperone, the two of them locked together in a slow dance of supervision. And we know from letters and diaries that the longing for one unobserved hour, to read what one liked, think what one liked, simply be no one for a while, could become a quiet ache. Privacy, the thing you spend without noticing, was here a rare and precious luxury. Some historians argue this constant surveillance was among the heaviest burdens of the age, a near total denial of the inner freedom we now consider basic, the right simply to be alone. Others suggest that within these limits, women built deep, sustaining bonds with the very women who watched them, that the chaperone was often also a confidant, a teacher, a friend. The truth probably lies somewhere between. You were never alone, and that was a prison, but you were also never lonely in the way we can be, and that, perhaps, was a strange mercy. Still, your modern soul, which needs an hour to itself the way it needs air, would feel the walls of it before lunch. You glance at the doorway. Someone is there, gently, with you. Someone will always be there. And you let out a breath, as deep as the stays will allow, and you begin to understand. By mid-morning, you are expected to make conversation. And conversation, it turns out, is another set of rules wearing the costume of ease. Perhaps callers arrive, or you go out to make calls of your own. Either way, you will sit in a warm drawing room, gloved, upright, and you will talk. And almost everything your modern self finds natural to say will be here slightly wrong. You would be too direct, too honest, too quick to share an opinion, to mention money, to ask a real question, to say what you actually thought about anything that mattered. And each of those instincts would land, softly, like a small breach. The art of conversation here is the art of pleasant surfaces. You may discuss the weather, the health of relations, a concert, a sermon, the general doings of acquaintances. You may compliment, you may agree, you may gently, gently disagree about something that does not matter. What you may not do in polite mixed company is raise the subjects that actually move a human heart. Money, religion in any pointed way, politics with any heat, anything indelicate, anything that might cause a flush or a frown. Strong feeling, openly expressed, is itself a kind of indecency. Here's a mainstream fact. Conversation among polite Victorians was governed by an elaborate ideal of agreeableness. The goal was harmony, not honesty, comfort, not truth. To be a good conversationalist was to make others feel at ease, to draw them out, to never dominate, to never bore, and above all never to embarrass. A clever woman learned to be interesting without being forward, charming without being bold, present without ever being the center. Here's a quirky tidbit. Because so much could not be said directly, an entire shadow language grew up to carry the real messages. The folding of a card, the giving of a particular flower, the choice of a song at the piano, even the way a fan was held. All of these could speak the things that words were not allowed to speak. People conducted whole courtships, whole quarrels, whole declarations of love in a code of objects and gestures. precisely because the spoken word was kept so carefully empty. Some historians argue this culture of polite emptiness was deadening, that it trained an entire class, and women especially, to suppress original thought, to fear sincerity, to mistake blandness for virtue. Others suggest that beneath the smooth surface a great deal was actually being communicated, that the codes were rich and the silences were full, that intelligent people said enormous amounts to one another without ever breaking the rules. The truth probably lies somewhere between. The conversation was empty and it was coded. It said nothing and it said everything, and you would spend the whole visit exhausting yourself trying to say almost nothing at all in exactly the right way. The visit ends, as visits do, at precisely the moment etiquette dictates. You rise, the prescribed words are exchanged, and you carry yourself out into the rest of the long, performed morning. Visiting in this world is not casual, and the morning call would catch you out on timing alone. When a lady called upon another, there were hours for it. Confusingly, the morning call often happened in the early afternoon, and there were lengths for it, and the lengths were short. A formal call was a brief, bright, shallow thing, 15 or perhaps 20 minutes, and then you rose and left, whether or not the conversation had gone anywhere, whether or not you had anything more to say. To stay too long was a genuine breach. To overstay was to be the sort of person who did not understand, and not understanding was, here, close to unforgivable. So picture your modern self, settling into a comfortable chair, warming to a pleasant companion, beginning at last to enjoy something, and being expected, by an invisible clock everyone else can hear, to stand up and go. You would misjudge it. You would stay too long, or leave too soon, or linger awkwardly in the doorway over the elaborate ritual of departure. And your hostess, smiling, would file it away. Here's a mainstream fact about how this worked. The whole system of calls and cards and at-home days formed a kind of social timetable. Ladies had particular days and hours when they received visitors, which were known and observed, and the rounds of calling, leaving cards, returning calls, marking acquaintance, were the actual labor of maintaining one's place in society. It was work, real work, though no one would ever have called it that, and a lady might spend a great part of her week simply tending this web. Here's a quirky tidbit. The brevity was partly self-defense. Because everyone was obliged to call and be called upon, a short call let a busy lady get through many in an afternoon, dispatching her social duties like a general reviewing troops, a card here, a quarter hour there. The shallowness wasn't an accident of coldness. It was the only way the sheer volume of obligation could be managed. Friendship, real friendship, happened elsewhere, in longer and less formal meetings. The call was the tax you paid to belong. Some historians argue this turned human connection into bookkeeping, that relationships became entries in a ledger of cards given and returned, warmth replaced by accountancy. Others suggest the system, for all its stiffness, kept a far-flung society stitched together, gave shy people a script, gave isolated women a reason and a right to leave the house and see one another. The truth probably lies somewhere between. It was bookkeeping, and it was also a lifeline, a duty, and also sometimes the best part of the day. You make your calls, you leave on time, or near enough, and the early afternoon opens before you. The strange Victorian problem of what on earth a lady is supposed to do with all her hours. Somewhere in the day, very likely, comes charity, and here your modern self would feel something complicated, a kindness with a cold thread running through it. A lady of this class was expected to be good, and goodness for her took particular forms. She might visit the poor of the parish, carrying a basket, soup, bread, perhaps a little flannel, a tract or a Bible. She might sit on the committee of some charitable society, or sew garments for the needy, or teach in a Sunday school. Philanthropy was one of the very few activities that took a respectable woman out of her own narrow world and gave her something that looked almost like purpose. And so she went, basket on her arm, into the streets and cottages of people whose lives she could scarcely imagine. Charitable visiting was enormous in this period, one of the principal outlets for the energies of women who were barred from professions, from politics, from almost every public role. Through it, many women did real and lasting good, and some discovered a competence and a passion that would, in a later generation, flower into reform, into nursing, into the first careers. The basket on the arm was for more than a few women the first step out of the cage. Here's a quirky tidbit with a sting in it. Much of this charity came wrapped in judgment. There was an obsession with the deserving poor, those who were clean, sober, grateful, and properly humble, as against the undeserving who were not. Aid often came with inspection, with moral instruction, with the clear understanding that the giver was above and the receiver below. A lady might genuinely wish to help, and at the very same moment be quietly appraising whether the family deserved it, whether the cottage was tidy enough, whether the gratitude was sincere. Some historians argue this charity was as much about the giver as the given, a way for the wealthy to feel virtuous, to display their status, to manage and soothe the poor without ever questioning the system that made them poor. Others suggest we should not be so cynical, that real compassion and real relief flowed through these visits, that the women who made them often cared deeply and learned, slowly, to see. The truth probably lies somewhere between. The kindness was real. The condescension was real. They sat in the same basket, side by side, all the way down the lane. You step out of a small, cold cottage into the gray afternoon light, and you carry away with you a face, a voice, a child's cough, a name you will half remember, or perhaps a name you never thought to ask. And the carriage is waiting to take you back to the warm, upholstered, well-fed world where you belong. By now your body, laced and corseted and walked about and underfed at breakfast, would be sending up a single clear signal: you are hungry. And the day would answer, gently, that hunger is not quite ladylike. Luncheon is a lighter meal, often among women, taken in the middle of the day. There is food, of course. There is always food in this world, rivers of it, for those who have it. But the way a lady approaches it is hedged about with the same delicate restraint as everything else. To eat with frank appetite, to take a second helping with evident pleasure, to admit you were truly hungry, all of this brushed against the ideal of the ethereal, the refined, the woman who seemed almost to live on sentiment and tea. Here's a mainstream fact. There was a real cultural ideal, especially earlier in the century, of the delicate, fragile, faintly unwell woman, pale, slender, easily tired, with little appetite. And it was tangled up with notions of refinement and even of beauty. A robust, ruddy, hearty appetite belonged, in this snobbish imagination, to working women, to the coarse and the common. So a lady might genuinely train herself away from her own hunger, pick at her plate, and call it good manners. Here's a quirky tidbit. This is the same impulse that, a little later in the century, helped give rise to that great institution, afternoon tea. Small, pretty, manageable quantities of food, taken delicately, a socially perfect way to eat without seeming to eat much at all. The dainty sandwich, the small cake, the careful pour. It was, among other things, a solution to the problem of being a hungry woman in a world that preferred you didn't appear to be. Some historians argue this policing of women's appetite was quietly corrosive, an early version of a pressure women would carry for centuries, the demand to be small, to take up little space, to apologize even for the appetites of the body. Others suggest we can overstate it, that plenty of Victorian women ate well and heartily in private and among intimates, that the delicate ideal was a fashion of the drawing room more than a fact of every table. The truth probably lies somewhere between. In public, you would pretend not to be hungry. In private, perhaps, you'd be human, and you would learn, fast, which rooms were which. You eat your careful little luncheon. It is not enough, and you smile as though it were plenty. The clock moves on. A long, strange, empty afternoon, the part of the day that broke more spirits than any corset ever did, is finally here. And now we come to the thing that would truly undo you. Not a rule, not a garment. The emptiness. The afternoon of a leisured lady could be a vast, soft, upholstered desert of time. The household runs itself in the hands of servants. You do not cook, you do not clean, you do not work for money. You do not, in most cases, even raise your own small children hour by hour. There are nurses and governesses for that. So the hours open before you, and they must be filled, and the things you are permitted to fill them with are few, and most of them are quiet. You might read if the book is approved. You might write letters. You might do needlework, embroidery, fancy work, the endless decorative stitching that gave idle hands something to hold. You might practice the piano, or paint a little watercolor, or arrange flowers, or simply sit. There might be a drive in the park later to see and be seen. But for long stretches, your task is, essentially, to occupy yourself decoratively until the next fixed point in the day arrives. Here's a mainstream fact that historians take very seriously. This enforced idleness was a genuine source of suffering. The medical literature of the age is full of women diagnosed with nerves, with hysteria, with neurasthenia, with a vague, draining malaise, and many thoughtful people, then and since, have connected this directly to lives starved of purpose, of meaningful work, of any real outlet for intelligent, energetic minds. A woman could be educated just enough to long for more, and then handed nothing to do with it but tapestry. Here's a quirky tidbit, and it's almost unbearable. One of the most famous stories of this whole subject involves a woman ordered for her nervous condition to rest completely. No work, no writing, no stimulation, a fashionable cure that amounted to enforced, total idleness, and which drove some patients closer to breakdown rather than away from it. The prescription for a woman crushed by having nothing to do was often to give her even less. The cure was the disease. Some historians argue this idleness was the cruelest part of upper-class womanhood, that poverty at least came with work and purpose, while wealth could come with a soft, smothering nothing, a lifelong Sunday afternoon with no evening promised. Others suggest women filled these hours more richly than we imagine, with reading and friendship and accomplishment and inner life, and that we should not pity them too quickly from our busy century. The truth probably lies somewhere between. The hours were empty and the women were not, but the emptiness was real, and it pressed down, soft and heavy, like snow. You sit by the window with your needlework, and the light moves slowly across the floor, and the clock ticks and ticks, and you begin, at last, to understand the deepest truth of this gilded life, that the hardest thing it asked of you was not to suffer, but simply to endure being still. Later in the afternoon, the cage opens just a little, and you are let out to be looked at. The carriage is brought round, and you are dressed again in something suitable for the occasion, and you go to the park. In London, this meant the great fashionable drives and rows of Hyde Park, where at the right hour the whole of polite society gathered, not to walk or rest or take the air for its own sake, but to see and to be seen. Carriages moved at a slow, deliberate pace, so that their occupants could be admired. Riders walked their horses. Everyone watched everyone. It was a daily open-air performance, and you were both audience and spectacle. You would find it at first almost pleasant, The movement, the light, the faces. And then you would feel the familiar pressure settle back over you, because this too is work. Your dress is being read. Your carriage is being priced. Who bows to you, who does not, who you are seen beside, who pointedly fails to see you. All of it is data, gathered and exchanged, a silent newspaper of status, published fresh each afternoon. Here's a mainstream fact. The fashionable promenade was a genuine social institution. To appear in the right place at the right hour, correctly dressed, was to assert and maintain your standing. To be absent too long was to risk being forgotten. The park was a stage on which the rankings of society were performed and confirmed, day after day, in a slow parade of horses and wheels and bonnets. Here's a quirky tidbit. The codes were minute and merciless. The cut of a coat, the breeding of a horse, the livery of a servant, whether one drove or rode, even the precise hour of one's appearance. Each detail signaled where one stood, and the initiated read them at a glance. A newcomer with money but no knowledge could get every visible thing right, and still, somehow, be wrong, undone by some tiny note of trying too hard. The park forgave nothing and explained nothing. Some historians argue this endless mutual surveillance was exhausting and hollow. Society reduced to a beauty contest of belongings, human worth measured in horseflesh and millinery. Others suggest the promenade also offered real pleasures, fresh air and movement, in lives starved of both, the genuine delight of finery and spectacle, the chance to glimpse the wide world of one's set and feel oneself part of something glittering. The truth probably lies somewhere between. You were on display, and it was tiring. You were also, for an hour, out in the light and the open air. And after the long gray afternoon, even a performance felt like freedom. The carriage turns for home as the light begins to soften. You have been seen. You have done your duty to the long parade. And now you must hurry back, because the most demanding performance of the entire day is still ahead. Here is a detail that sounds almost like a joke until you live inside it. You would change your clothes completely, again and again, all day long. And your modern self, who might happily wear one comfortable outfit from morning to night, would find this one rule alone nearly unbearable. There was a morning dress, simpler, for the private hours at home. There might be a different dress for going out, for making calls, for walking. There was something specific for the carriage, for the afternoon at home, for tea. And then, crowning it all, there was the elaborate evening toilette for dinner. A lady of means might change her entire ensemble 4, 5, 6 times in a single day, each costume correct for its hour and its activity. Each one requiring, remember, the help of a maid to fasten what your own hands could not reach. Here's a mainstream fact. This relentless changing was, in part, pure conspicuous consumption, a way of demonstrating that you owned enough clothing and commanded enough servant hours to be redressed all day long. To wear a morning gown into the afternoon or to appear at dinner in what you'd worn for calls was to confess a kind of poverty, or worse, a kind of not caring, which was its own offense. Here's a quirky tidbit. The labor underneath this fell, invisibly, on others. Every changed costume meant garments to be aired, brushed, mended, pressed, and put away. It meant a lady's maid whose whole life was the care of cloth, who knew every hook and stay and stain, who waited, always, just out of sight, ready to unfasten the last performance and fasten the next. Your endless freshness rested entirely on her endless work. Some historians argue the changing ritual perfectly captures the strange uselessness at the heart of this life. Energy and resource poured into appearance, into surface, into a churn of dressing and undressing that produced nothing but the impression of importance. Others suggest dress was a genuine art and pleasure for many women, a real form of creativity and self-expression in lives where so much else was forbidden, and that to sneer at it is to miss what it meant to them. The truth probably lies somewhere between. It was vanity and it was art. It was waste and it was one of the few canvases a woman was handed. Either way, the bell will soon ring, and you must go up and become someone new again for dinner. Before the evening, though, there is tea, and of all the rituals of the day, this is the one your modern self might almost love, and still get subtly, quietly wrong. In the later afternoon, in the soft gap between luncheon and the late dinner, came tea, a smaller, warmer, more feminine ceremony, often presided over by the lady of the house herself. The tea things were brought in, the pot, the cups, the milk, the sugar, the little plates of thin bread and butter, the cake. And the lady poured. That act, the pouring of tea for one's guests, was a small performance of grace and hospitality, watched and judged like everything else, but gentler, more intimate, almost kind. Here's a mainstream fact. Afternoon tea as a social ritual grew and flourished across this century, and it became one of the defining rhythms of genteel life, a moment of pause, of warmth, of carefully managed sociability. It had its own etiquette, of course, how the cup was held, how one stirred without clinking, how one balanced plate and cup and glove and conversation all at once, without a single graceless motion. But its spirit was softer than the morning's cold campaign of cards. Here's a quirky tidbit. The whole apparatus was, in part, theater of refinement. The thinness of the bread and butter, the delicacy of the cakes, the smallness of the portions, all of it performed gentility, the idea of a woman who ate like a bird and lived on grace. And the tea table became, quietly, one of the few stages where women held real authority. It was her pot, her ritual, her domain, and within it she ruled, dispensing warmth and attention, and when she chose, a cool and unmistakable chill. Some historians argue that rituals like tea were sweet cages within the cage. Pleasant, yes, but one more elaborate way to fill a woman's empty hours and keep her safely occupied with cups and spoons. Others suggest the tea table was something more, a genuine female space, a place of real friendship and real talk, where, behind the etiquette, women sustained one another through lives that often gave them little else. The truth probably lies somewhere between. It was a performance and it was a comfort, a ritual of restriction and a small warm hearth of belonging. And as the cups are cleared, the light is failing, and the great machinery of the evening begins to turn. You may be wondering by now what you were ever taught to do, if not to work, or think freely, or move about the world. And the answer is its own small heartbreak. You were taught to be accomplished, which is not quite the same as being skilled. A young lady of this class was educated, but educated toward a particular end, to be charming, cultivated, and decorative, an ornament to her family, and in time, to a husband. She learned to play the piano, perhaps to sing. She learned a little French or Italian, enough to pepper her speech and read a romantic line. She learned to draw, to paint in watercolors, to dance, to do fine needlework. These were the accomplishments, and they were displayed at the right moments, like the jewels they functionally were. Here's a mainstream fact. The education of upper-class girls was, for much of this period, shaped less toward knowledge for its own sake than toward marriageability. Deep learning in a woman was often regarded with suspicion, even as a disadvantage. A girl who was too clever, too bookish, too openly intellectual might be thought unwomanly, hard to marry, so the curriculum was carefully calibrated to produce a pleasing surface, enough culture to converse and entertain, rarely enough to challenge or compete. Here's a quirky tidbit. The whole system was beautifully circular and a little absurd. A girl spent years acquiring accomplishments, largely in order to attract a husband. Once the husband was secured, the accomplishments were often quietly set aside. The piano closed, the paintbox shelved, the French forgotten. The skills were not for her. They were bait, and once they had served their purpose, they could be allowed to fade, and usually were. Some historians argue this was an immense waste of human capacity. Generations of intelligent women trained only to ornament. Their minds deliberately kept shallow, their real powers never developed or used. Others suggest the accomplishments were not nothing, that music, art, and language brought genuine joy and inner richness, that some women took them far beyond mere display, and that within the narrow garden they were given, real flowers grew. The truth probably lies somewhere between. You were taught to shimmer, not to build. And on a good day, the shimmer was lovely. On a bad day, you could feel, behind it, all the rooms of your own mind you were never given the key to. The candles are being lit now. Somewhere above, your evening gown is laid out, waiting, and it is time once more to be transformed. Of all the day's dressings, the evening toilette is the grandest, the longest, and the one that would test your patience to its very end. Because now you are being prepared not merely to be presentable, but to be magnificent. You go up. The fire is lit in your room, and the whole long ceremony begins again, but slower and more elaborate now. The hair is the great project of the evening, brushed out, oiled, arranged, pinned, perhaps built over pads or pieces into the towering, intricate styles the age admired, ornamented with combs, or flowers, or jewels. The evening gown is brought, lower at the neck and shoulders than the daytime dresses, richer in fabric, heavier with trimming, the gloves, long and pale, the jewels, chosen and clasped, and over all of it, the maid's patient hands, fastening, smoothing, adjusting, until the woman in the glass is a kind of artwork. Here's a mainstream fact. The evening, with its dinners and parties and balls, was the great theater of upper-class life, and a woman's appearance there carried enormous weight. Her gown, her jewels, her hair, her bearing, all of it announced her family's wealth and her own place, and all of it would be minutely noted. To be underdressed was an embarrassment. To be overdressed, or dressed wrongly for the occasion, was worse. The stakes of getting it right were high, and the preparation was correspondingly immense. Here's a quirky tidbit. The famous low neckline of the evening gown coexisted, strikingly, with the extreme modesty of the daytime, when a respectable woman covered herself almost completely. The body that must be wrapped to the throat by day could be displayed by the rules of evening dress in a way that would have been scandalous at noon. The codes were not about the body itself, but about context, about time and place. Bare shoulders were perfectly proper at a ball, and unthinkable at a morning call, and a lady carried this whole shifting map of permission in her head. Some historians argue the evening splendor was the cage at its most gilded, the woman as object reaching her highest polish, dressed and jeweled and displayed like a prize. Others suggest the evening was also, for many women, the most alive part of the day. Music, light, company, dancing, beauty, the genuine pleasures of a glittering social world that they helped to create and rule. The truth probably lies somewhere between. You are being made into an ornament, and you are also being made beautiful, and you would feel both at once as the last pin slid home. The dinner gong sounds, low and round, through the house. You take a breath, as deep as you can, and you go down. Dinner is the summit of the day, and it is governed by a system so rigid that your one wrong move would be felt all around the table. You enter the drawing room where the guests have gathered, and at once an invisible order asserts itself. For when dinner is announced, the company does not simply wander in. They process in pairs, in a strict sequence determined by rank. each gentleman escorting a particular lady, in an order that everyone but you seems to know by heart. Your place at the table is fixed, your dinner partner is assigned, and the entire architecture rests on precedence, the precise ranked order of social importance, which decides who goes first, who sits where, who is honored, and who is not. Here's a mainstream fact. Precedence was a genuine and serious science in this world. There were rules, and books of rules, governing exactly how people of different ranks should be ordered. Who outranked whom, who took whom in to dinner, who sat nearest the host. A hostess planning a dinner had to solve this puzzle correctly or risk real offense. To seat someone below their proper place was an insult that could be remembered for years. The seating of a table was diplomacy, and the stakes were real. Here's a quirky tidbit. The meal itself was a marathon of many courses, served in a particular order, with particular implements, eaten in a particular way. And conversation, too, was choreographed. At many dinners, a lady was expected to turn the table, to talk first with the partner on one side, and then, at the signal of the hostess shifting her own attention, to turn and talk with the partner on the other. The whole table pivoting together like a slow, polite machine. To talk to the wrong neighbor at the wrong moment was to break the rhythm, visibly, for everyone. Some historians argue this obsession with rank and order reveals the cold heart of the system. Human beings reduced to their positions, hospitality turned into a chart, warmth replaced by hierarchy. Others suggest the elaborate forms also made things possible, that they let large groups of near strangers dine and talk in comfort, that the structure was a kind of courtesy, sparing everyone the awkwardness of figuring it out fresh each time. The truth probably lies somewhere between. The order was cold, and it was also a kind of choreography, a hierarchy, and also a dance. And you, not knowing the steps, would feel the whole table turn without you once, and know yourself gently exposed. And then, near the end of dinner, comes a moment that would startle your modern self more than almost anything else in the day. The women get up and leave. At a certain point, when the meal is winding toward its close, the hostess catches the eyes of the ladies and rises, and all the women of the party rise with her and withdraw, leaving the men alone at the table with their wine, their cigars, their port, and their conversation. The ladies go through to the drawing room, to coffee and quieter talk, to wait. After a while, the gentlemen rejoin them. But for that interval, the company is cleanly, deliberately divided by sex. The men left to the subjects and substances thought unfit for ladies' ears. Here's a mainstream fact. This withdrawing of the ladies was a long-standing custom of the formal dinner, and it neatly expressed one of the deepest assumptions of the age, that there were men's spheres and women's spheres, men's talk and women's talk, and that the serious matters, politics, business, the coarser jokes, the heavier drinking, belonged to the men, while the women were ushered gently into a softer and more decorative holding room until they were wanted again. Here's a quirky tidbit. The drawing room itself takes its name from exactly this. It is the withdrawing room, the room into which the company withdrew. The very architecture of the house encoded the ritual, and the separation, though framed as delicacy, as sparing the ladies from rough talk, also quietly cut women out of precisely the conversations where opinions were formed and arrangements were made. The after-dinner hour, when over the wine, the men of a class shaped a good deal of the world. Some historians argue this segregation was a fundamental mechanism of women's exclusion, a daily ritual reminder that the real business of life happened in rooms they were asked to leave. Others suggest the women's hour had its own value, that the drawing room after dinner was a space of female solidarity and frank talk, a relief from the strain of mixed company, a place where women could finally, briefly, be more themselves. The truth probably lies somewhere between. And you were also, perhaps, set free for half an hour among your own. And you would feel, sitting there with the coffee and the other women, the strange double truth of your whole position, shut out of one room and quietly at home in another. Now, in the candlelit drawing room with the other women around you, you might let yourself wonder what all of it was for. The lacing, the cards, the accomplishments, the endless careful performance. And the answer, the real engine beneath the entire machine, is one you'd find hard to bear. It was all, in the end, about marriage. For a woman of this class, marriage was not one path among many. It was very nearly the only path. She could not respectably take up a profession. She could not easily earn or control money. Her education, her accomplishments, her beauty, her reputation, her whole carefully managed self, all of it was finally preparation for the single great transaction of being married well. A good marriage secured her future, her status, her home, her very identity. A failure to marry could mean a long dependent life on the edges of other people's households, the spinster aunt, tolerated and pitied. Here's a mainstream fact. The social season, with its balls and dinners and parties, functioned in large part as a marriage market, an organized arena in which eligible young women were introduced, displayed, and matched with suitable men under the watchful management of mothers and chaperones. The romance was real, sometimes, but underneath the romance ran cold currents of money, land, rank, and family advantage, and everyone, however gracefully, knew it. Here's a quirky tidbit. So much of what we have already walked through was secretly in service of this one end. The chaperone guarded the reputation that set the price. The accomplishments advertised the goods. The careful conversation, the modest appetite, the perfect composure, all of it was in part a long audition. Even the gowns and the jewels were, among other things, a kind of prospectus. The whole shimmering day was in its bones, a courtship you could not opt out of. Some historians argue this reduced women to commodities, bred, trained, displayed, and traded for the benefit of family and fortune, their hearts an afterthought to the contract. Others suggest the picture was more human and more mixed, that love matches did happen, that women exercised real choice and real cunning within the system, that marriage also offered, alongside its constraints, genuine companionship, a household to run, a sphere to rule. The truth probably lies somewhere between. It was a market, and it was also sometimes a meeting of two real people. But the market was always there, underneath, and you would feel it, even on the dance floor, even in the candlelight, the quiet, constant question of what you were worth and to whom. And here is the hardest fact of all to sit with, the one that holds the whole cage shut. Even the wealth around you, the house, the carriages, the jewels, the very gowns on your back, was in a deep legal sense not truly yours. For much of this century, the law of the land worked against you in ways your modern self would find almost unbelievable. Under the old doctrine of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was largely absorbed into her husband's. In practice, this could mean that property she brought to the marriage, money she might earn, even in the starkest cases, her claim on her own children, fell under her husband's control. She could be surrounded by riches and own, in her own right, very little. The golden life was, quite literally, held in someone else's name. The legal position of married women in this period was severely restricted, and reformers fought long campaigns across the century to change it, to win married women the right to own and keep their own property and earnings. Those reforms came gradually, hard-fought, late, and unevenly. For a great part of the era, A woman of even the highest rank could find that her financial self was, in the eyes of the law, an extension of her husband's. Here's a quirky tidbit with real weight behind it. This is why the marriage settlement, the legal arrangement negotiated, often by fathers and lawyers before a wedding, mattered so enormously among families of property. It was, in part, an attempt to protect a bride's interests in advance, to fence off some portion of wealth for her or her future children, precisely because the default position of the law gave her so little. Love might bring two people to the altar, but lawyers, very often, had been there first. Some historians argue this legal subjection was the true foundation of women's powerlessness in the age, that beneath every social rule lay this hard economic and legal fact: a woman's near total dependence, by law, on the men in her life. Others suggest reality was more tangled, that many women wielded great informal power within their households and marriages, managed money in practice, and were far from the helpless figures the law on paper implied. The truth probably lies somewhere between. On paper, you owned almost nothing. In life, you might rule a great house. But the paper was always there, and you would feel its cold edge under all the velvet. The knowledge that the gilded world you moved through, you did not, in the end, possess. But before you go up to bed, let your mind drift, just once, downward, below the polished floors, below the warm, bright rooms, to the other house that lives inside your house, and the people in it, whose names you are never quite taught to learn. For every hour of ease you have spent today, someone has worked. The fire that warmed your waking was laid by hands cold from the early dark. The water you washed in was carried up flight after flight of back stairs. The food you picked at so daintily was bought, hauled, plucked, scrubbed, and cooked in a hot basement kitchen by people who rose before you and would sleep long after. A great house ran on a hidden army: housemaids, kitchen maids, the cook, the butler, the footman, the scullery girl, your own lady's maid. And the whole genius of the arrangement was that you should see as little of their labor as possible. The work was meant to be invisible. The workers, very nearly, were too. Here's a mainstream fact. Domestic service was one of the largest forms of employment in this world, and a single prosperous household might keep many servants, each with a precise rank and role, organized into their own strict hierarchy below stairs that mirrored the one above. They had their own order of precedence, their own table, their own rules, a whole society running quietly in parallel, keeping yours afloat. Here's a quirky tidbit that catches the strangeness of it perfectly. In some great houses, servants were expected to turn and face the wall, or otherwise make themselves unobtrusive, if a member of the family passed them in a corridor, to perform their own invisibility, to pretend almost not to be there. You could pass a person a dozen times a day and never once meet her eyes. She knew everything about you: what you ate, what you wore, what you threw away, perhaps your secrets. You might not know where in the house she slept. Some historians argue this rendered an entire class of working people functionally invisible, present everywhere, acknowledged nowhere, their humanity sanded away to keep the comfort of their employers seamless. Others suggest the bond between served and servant could also be real and complex. Loyalty, affection, lifelong attachments, a lady's maid who became, over decades, something almost like a friend. The truth probably lies somewhere between. The labor was hidden, and the people were real, and the not seeing was itself one of the quiet cruelties you would be asked, without ever being told, to practice every single day. And what of the children, your children in this imagined life? Here, too, your modern heart would ache at how the cage was built, for even motherhood, in this world, was kept at a strange and managed distance. A lady of this class did not, on the whole, raise her young children with her own hands, hour by hour, the way mothers in other walks of life did and do. The babies were given to a wet nurse, perhaps, and then to a nanny. The older children to a nursery presided over by a nurse, and later to a governess for the girls and tutors or school for the boys. The children lived, in a sense, in their own country within the house, the nursery floor, up above, and were brought down to their mother at appointed times, washed and brushed and on their best behavior, to be admired, kissed, and then taken away again. Here's a mainstream fact. In the wealthier households, the daily care of children was largely delegated, and a mother might see her own small children for relatively brief, formal periods of the day. This was not, by the standards of the time and class, thought cold. It was simply how things were done, a mark of status, an arrangement that freed the lady for her social duties and entrusted the children to trained hands. Love was not absent, but the constant, ordinary, hands-on closeness we now take for granted was often, structurally, missing. Here's a quirky tidbit. For many children of this class, the most important emotional figure of early life was not the mother at all, but the nanny, the warm, constant presence who fed them, comforted them, scolded them, and tucked them in, while the beautiful, distant mother appeared like a lovely visitor from another world. Generations of memoirs are full of this, a fierce love for nanny, and a more wistful, more formal feeling for the mother, glimpsed in Silk, on her way out to dinner. Some historians argue this distance robbed both mother and child of something precious, and reflected how thoroughly even the most natural bonds were reshaped by class and custom. Others suggest we should not assume coldness from the arrangement alone, that deep maternal love flowed through it, in letters, in worry, in moments stolen and treasured, and that many of these mothers loved fiercely within the forms available to them. The truth probably lies somewhere between. The love was there. The distance was there too, built into the very floors of the house, the nursery above, the drawing room below, and a child carried gently down the stairs at the appointed hour, and gently up again. Somewhere in this life, very likely, your body would finally protest. And the way the age answered a woman's suffering is its own quiet horror, dressed in the language of care. Think of how your day has gone, laced tight from dawn, underfed by rule, walked and driven and dressed and undressed, watched every waking hour, forbidden deep feeling, real work, true solitude, honest speech. Is it any wonder that the women of this world were so often unwell, tired, faint, low, anxious, afflicted with the vague and pervasive complaint the age called nerves? And when a woman did break down under all of this, the medicine of the time had a whole vocabulary ready for her, and very little real understanding. Here's a mainstream fact. Women's ailments in this period were frequently bundled under sweeping, ill-defined diagnoses: hysteria, nervous exhaustion, neurasthenia, terms that often said more about the doctor's assumptions than about the patient's bodies. A vast range of real distress, physical and emotional, was filtered through the belief that women were inherently delicate, excitable, and governed by their reproductive systems, and treated accordingly, often without anyone pausing to ask what in these women's lives might be making them ill. Here's a quirky tidbit, and it's a dark one. The treatments could be strange and counterproductive. We have already met the rest cure, that fashionable prescription of total idleness and isolation, which could push a struggling woman further into despair. There were tonics, many of them useless, some of them laced with substances we would now find alarming. There was the smelling bottle, the fainting couch, the darkened room. A woman's collapse was managed, soothed, and contained, but rarely was its true cause, the airless shape of her life, ever named. Some historians argue this medicalizing of women's distress was a powerful tool of control, a way of explaining away women's unhappiness and rebellion as illness, of treating the symptoms of an unbearable situation while leaving the situation untouched. Others suggest the doctors were not all villains, that they worked with the limited knowledge of their day and sometimes with real compassion, and that some women found in the language of nerves a rare permission to rest, to withdraw, to be cared for at all. The truth probably lies somewhere between. The suffering was real, the understanding was thin, and a woman might lie in a darkened room, being treated for everything except the actual weight pressing on her chest. And then there was death, which came often in this century, and even grief, even the rawest of human feelings, was wrapped in rules so elaborate that you would surely break them. When someone died, a respectable family entered mourning, and mourning was not merely felt, it was performed, precisely, in dress and conduct, for fixed lengths of time, according to the closeness of the relation. There were degrees of black, and then of gray and mauve, worn in a prescribed sequence as grief was permitted slowly to fade. There were rules for how long a widow mourned, how long for a parent, a child, a cousin, rules for the jewelry one might wear, the paper one wrote on, the social events one must refuse. Grief had a calendar, and the calendar was public, and everyone could read from your very clothes exactly whom you had lost and how recently. Here's a mainstream fact. Mourning etiquette reached extraordinary heights in this age, especially for women, and especially for widows, who might be expected to wear deep mourning for a long period, swathed in dull black fabric, withdrawn from the bright world, their loss displayed upon their bodies for all to see. An entire industry grew up to supply the clothes, the crepe, the jet jewelry, the black-bordered stationery. Grief was, among other things, a market. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Queen herself set the great example. After the death of her beloved husband, Victoria withdrew into a mourning so profound and so prolonged that it shaped the mood of the age, retiring from public life and wearing black for the rest of her long reign. Her sorrow became a kind of national style, and the cult of mourning that flourished beneath her was in part an echo of her own. A whole empire took its cues for grief from one widow's unending black. Some historians argue this ritualization of mourning was oppressive, that it trapped women, widows above all, in long periods of enforced isolation and joyless display, turning private sorrow into yet another public performance and another cage. Others suggest the rituals also served the grieving, that the clear forms gave shape to unbearable feeling, signaled to the world how to treat the bereaved, and granted a kind of protected time to mourn that our own hurried age has largely lost. The truth probably lies somewhere between. The rules were heavy, and the rules were also a strange comfort, a prison of crepe and a structure to lean on when the worst had happened. And you, feeling something real and raw, would wear the wrong shade too soon and be quietly judged for the color of your sorrow. But not every evening ends so soon or so quietly. On the brightest nights of the season, the day would stretch on, past dinner, into the great glittering ordeal that was the ball. And there, amid all that light and music, you would find one more small object designed to defeat you. Picture it, a great house ablaze with candles and gas, flowers everywhere, an orchestra tuning, the floor cleared and waxed to a shine, and the rooms filling with the cream of society in their finest silks and black coats and jewels. It is beautiful beyond anything your day has held, and it is still work, because the ball is the marriage market at its most dazzling and most exposed, and every dance, every partner, every moment on the floor or off it is watched and weighed. Here's a mainstream fact. At a formal ball, a young lady carried a dance card, a small card, often pretty, sometimes with a tiny pencil attached, on which the gentlemen who wished to dance with her wrote their names against the dances of the evening. To have a full card was a triumph, a public proof of one's popularity and success. To sit out dances, to have a card with empty lines, was a small, visible humiliation played out before the whole room. The card turned an evening of dancing into a kind of scoreboard. Here's a quirky tidbit. The rules around the card were intricate. A lady should not dance too many times with the same gentleman, lest it cause comment about her feelings or his intentions. She should not refuse one partner and then accept another for the same dance. She should keep faith with the names written down, in order, all evening. To manage a dance card correctly was to navigate a tiny diplomatic crisis with every line, and your modern self, charmed and breathless and entirely unschooled, would muddle it within the first hour, and somewhere a dowager would notice. Some historians argue the ball, for all its beauty, was the cage at its most cunning. Pleasure and pressure fused. A young woman's whole worth tallied in dances and glances, the romance only a glittering veil over the cold arithmetic of matches and money. Others suggest the balls were also genuinely joyful, that the music, the movement, the closeness, the thrill of being young and admired in a beautiful room were real delights, and that within the rules, real attraction and real happiness sometimes bloomed. The truth probably lies somewhere between. The ball was a trap and the ball was a wonder, a market, and a memory some women treasured all their lives. And as the music swells and the dancers turn, you stand at the edge with your little card, half enchanted, half undone. And then after all the glitter comes Sunday, and with it a different kind of day entirely, and ruled by its own quiet code that your modern self would find almost impossible to keep. Sunday in this world was the Sabbath, and it was observed in respectable households with real seriousness. There was church, of course, often more than once, the family processing to its pew, dressed with sober care, to sit through the sermon and the hymns and the long still hour of worship. And there was the hush that fell over the rest of the day. Many ordinary amusements set aside, cards and games and frivolous music discouraged or forbidden, the reading turned to scripture or improving works, the whole day given a weight of solemn rest. Even the servants in many houses were granted a little more ease, the cold meal prepared so that less work need be done. Here's a mainstream fact. Sabbath observance was a powerful force in this society, woven through law and custom alike. Sunday was meant to be set apart, kept quiet and devout, and the keeping of it was one more way that respectability and piety were displayed and policed. For the devout, it was a genuine and nourishing rhythm. For others, a long, enforced stillness to be endured. For nearly everyone of this class, simply the shape that one day in 7 was expected to take. Here's a quirky tidbit. The strictness could reach almost comic extremes in the most earnest households. Children forbidden their ordinary toys and made to play only with biblical pictures or Sunday books. The piano allowed only for hymns, novels put away, laughter lowered to a murmur. A whole day was, in effect, wrapped in cotton wool, and for a lively child or a restless young woman, the sheer slow weight of a strict Sunday could feel like time itself holding its breath. Some historians argue the Victorian Sunday was one more layer of constraint, a weekly tightening of the rules, dressed in piety, that fell like so much else, especially heavily on women and children, kept quietest and most confined. Others suggest the day of rest was a real gift in a hard-working world, a genuine pause, a source of meaning and community and peace for the many who believed, and a rare protected stillness in lives otherwise driven by duty. The truth probably lies somewhere between. The stillness was heavy, and the stillness was holy, a constraint and a kind of rest. And by the time the long Sunday dusk came down, you would understand that even the day of rest in this life was a day with rules you'd never fully learn. Somewhere in the bright middle of the day, perhaps, you would go shopping, And even this small pleasure, which your modern self knows so well, would unfold in a way that would quietly bewilder you, beginning with the strange fact that you would barely touch a coin. You are driven to the fashionable streets, your maid attending you, and you enter the great shops and the dressmakers and the drapers, and you are received almost like a guest. Chairs are brought. Goods are spread before you across the counter by attentive assistants. Silks unrolled in shining legs, gloves laid out, ribbons and laces and trimmings displayed for your consideration. You do not hurry. You do not, in the way you might imagine, simply pick a thing and pay for it and leave. You consider, you are shown, you are flattered, you choose, and the reckoning very often is not settled there at all. Here's a mainstream fact. For ladies of this class, much shopping was done on account. The goods were noted down, and the bill was sent to the husband or the father or the household to be settled later. A lady might move through a whole afternoon of acquiring beautiful things and never once handle the actual money, because the money was not, in the deepest sense, considered hers to handle. Her desires were indulged. The purse strings stayed in other hands. Here's a quirky tidbit. The grand shops understood exactly what they were selling, and it was not only goods, but experience, comfort, deference, a sense of luxury and ease, the theater of being waited upon. The rise of the great department stores later in the century would take this even further, creating dazzling palaces of commerce designed especially to welcome respectable women, to give them a rare public place where they could go and linger and feel both safe and grand. Shopping became one of the few adventures a lady could have on her own account, or nearly. Some historians argue this account-keeping was one more thread of dependence. The lady kept always at one remove from her own money, indulged with goods, but trusted with no real economic power, her wants met precisely so that her control never grew. Others suggest the shops also opened a genuine new space for women, a public world they were actually invited into, a theater of choice and pleasure, and even a kind of freedom within the narrow round of their days. The truth probably lies somewhere between. You could have almost anything you pointed to. You simply could not, in your own name, pay for it. And in that small gap lived the whole arrangement of your gilded, borrowed life. And what did you know, in this life, of the great world beyond your drawing room, of the empire, the politics, the inventions, the distant wars and wonders of your astonishing century? Less than you would think, and less than you would wish, for the window onto the world was kept for a lady, deliberately narrow. News came, of course. There were newspapers, and there was talk, and a clever woman gathered a great deal from both. But the public world, the world of parliament and business and the professions, of debate and decision and power, was framed firmly as a man's concern. A lady might follow it, might have opinions, might even in private be sharper about it than the men of her family. What she was not, on the whole, permitted to do was act in it. She could not vote. She could not sit in Parliament, or plead in court, or take up the professions. Her relationship to the wider world was that of a spectator at a window, watching a parade she was not allowed to join. Here's a mainstream fact. Throughout this era, the public sphere was overwhelmingly closed to women, who were by law and custom alike excluded from the vote, from most professions, and from formal political power. The doctrine of separate spheres held that man's place was the public world of work and politics, and woman's the private world of home and family. And though real life was always messier than the doctrine shaped real life with enormous force. Here's a quirky tidbit. And yet, precisely from within the private sphere, women found ways to reach outward and shape the public world after all, through their letters, their influence, their salons and dinner tables, their charitable work, their writing. Some of the most powerful currents of the age in reform and culture and conscience ran through the hands of women who could not vote for a single member of the government they helped to move. The window was narrow, but a determined woman learned to lean far out of it. Some historians argue this exclusion was the central injustice of the age for women, a near-total shutting out from public power and public life, a silencing that no amount of private influence could truly compensate. Others suggest the separate spheres also gave women a real domain of their own, genuine authority within the home and the moral and social life of their world, and that many wielded it with skill and satisfaction. The truth probably lies somewhere between. The window was real, and so were its bars, and you would stand at it, watching your extraordinary century rush past outside, knowing more than you were ever asked, and permitted to do almost nothing with what you knew. There is one place, though, where the cage opens onto something green and breathing, and your tired modern self would go to it gratefully: the garden. For of all the outdoor world, the garden was the piece a lady was most freely allowed to call her own. In the right hours, you might walk in it, slowly, properly, perhaps with a parasol against the sun, for a fashionable lady guarded her pale complexion as a mark of her class. You might tend it in the gentle, decorative way that was thought suitable, cutting flowers for the house, arranging them, growing roses, keeping a conservatory or a fernery, those glassed green rooms the age adored. You might sit in it with a book or your needlework, in the soft outdoor light, and feel for an hour almost unwatched, almost at ease, almost free. Here's a mainstream fact. Gardening and the love of flowers were enormously popular and entirely respectable pursuits for women of this class, encouraged as healthful, wholesome, and properly feminine. The garden was a permitted outdoors, a slice of nature brought safely within the bounds of the home, where a lady could take air and exercise and even a kind of creative power without ever stepping outside the rules. Flowers, their meanings, their arrangement, their cultivation, became a whole gentle language and art. Here's a quirky tidbit. That pale skin, so carefully guarded, tells its own story. A tan, in this world, marked a woman who worked outdoors, who labored in the sun, and so the leisured lady prized her whiteness, shaded herself with parasols and wide hats and gloves, and kept to the cooler hours. The very avoidance of the sun was a way of wearing one's class upon one's face. Even in the freedom of the garden, the rules followed, written in the shade of a parasol. Some historians argue the garden was simply a prettier corner of the same enclosure. Outdoor air on a leash, nature permitted only in its tamest, most ornamental form, one more space where a woman could be active so long as she was never truly wild or free. Others suggest the garden was a genuine refuge and joy, a place of real beauty, real skill, real peace, where many women found some of the deepest contentment their lives allowed. The truth probably lies somewhere between. It was a cage with the roof off, and it was also, on a warm afternoon among the roses, as close to liberty as the day would bring. And the scent of it, green leaves, warm earth, the sweetness of flowers, is a good thing to carry with you toward sleep. Back indoors, in those long quiet hours, you might reach for a book, and even here, in the privacy of reading, the rules would reach over your shoulder and turn the pages with you. Reading was encouraged for a lady, up to a point, and within limits. Improving works, poetry, history, devotional books, these were safe and approved. But the novel, especially the wrong sort of novel, was looked upon with a wary, watchful eye, particularly for young unmarried women. Fiction was thought to stir the imagination dangerously, to fill a girl's head with romance and longing, and ideas above her station, to awaken feelings better left asleep. So what you read, and when, and whether it was thought suitable, was a matter of quiet supervision. Here's a mainstream fact. There was real anxiety in this era about women's reading, and about novels in particular, which were sometimes blamed for everything from idleness to immorality to nervous overexcitement. Books might be vetted, certain works kept from younger readers, the circulating libraries themselves exercising a kind of gentle censorship over what respectable households received. And yet the century was, at the very same time, a golden age of the novel, devoured by women readers in enormous numbers. The disapproval and the appetite running side by side. Here's a quirky tidbit. Many of the very novels that shaped the age, that we still read and love today, were written by women, sometimes under men's names or no name at all, precisely because authorship itself was a fraught and not quite respectable thing for a lady. So women wrote, in secret or in disguise, the very stories that other women were being warned not to read too freely. The whole anxious machinery of approval and disapproval hummed along, while beneath it, women told and consumed their own stories with a quiet, unstoppable hunger. Some historians argue this policing of reading was one more way of controlling women's minds and imaginations, of keeping their inner lives as managed as their outer ones, fencing off whole continents of thought and feeling as unsafe. Others suggest the very intensity of women's reading shows how thoroughly they escaped that control, finding in books a freedom, a privacy, a wideness of experience that no chaperone could enter, a room of the mind that was truly their own. The truth probably lies somewhere between. The disapproval was real, and the reading went on anyway, in window seats and by candlelight, a quiet rebellion bound in cloth and paper. And perhaps that is the most hopeful thing in this whole long day, that wherever they could, in whatever corners they could find, these women kept some part of themselves free. There is one more burden to set gently on your shoulders before the day ends, and it is the heaviest and the most invisible of all. The sheer, constant expectation that you as a woman would be good, purer, kinder, more patient, more selfless, more spiritual than the men around you, the very conscience and moral center of your home. This was the great ideal of the age, the image of woman as the gentle angel of the household, set a little above the rough world of men, charged with keeping the family virtuous, the home holy, the children pious, her own heart unspotted. It sounds at first like a compliment, and it was meant as one, but carried every hour of every day, it became its own kind of cage. For an angel may not be tired, or selfish, or angry, or doubting, or merely human. To be placed on a pedestal is also to be told very firmly that you may never step down from it. Here's a mainstream fact. The ideal of woman as the moral and spiritual guardian of the home was central to the values of this era, and women were widely expected to be more naturally religious, more self-sacrificing, and more virtuous than men, to suffer patiently, to serve others before themselves, to find their highest fulfillment in devotion to husband, children, and God. Sermons, conduct books, poems, and popular wisdom all press this image upon them, relentlessly and from the cradle. Here's a quirky tidbit, and it carries a sting. This same exalting of female virtue could be used neatly to keep women in their place. For if a woman's glory lay in self-sacrifice, then her own desires, ambitions, and complaints became by definition failures of virtue. To want more freedom, more learning, more life, could be framed not as a reasonable hope, but as a kind of moral lapse, a falling short of the angelic standard. The pedestal and the cage, it turned out, were built from the very same stone. Some historians argue this idealizing of women was among the subtlest and most effective forms of control the age devised. Flattering women into their own confinement, dressing subjection up as honor, making a virtue of everything that kept them small. Others suggest the moral authority granted to women was also real and usable, that many women drew genuine strength, purpose, and even power from their role as the conscience of the home and the heart of the family, and turned it in time into a platform for reform and a voice in the world. The truth probably lies somewhere between. The halo was heavy, and it also sometimes lit the way out. And you, asked to be an angel, would feel the ache of it, the long, patient, unrelenting labor of being good, with no one ever quite asking whether you were happy. And should you leave the city at all, should the family remove to the country, or travel to take the waters, or visit relations in some distant house, even the journey would remind you, at every mile, how carefully your world was arranged around you. This was the great age of the railway, and travel had become faster and more wonderful than any generation before could have dreamed. But for a lady, it was travel of a particular cushioned kind. You would be conveyed, escorted, attended. Your luggage, and there would be a great deal of it, trunks of clothes for every occasion, was managed by servants and porters. You traveled in the better carriages, sheltered from the crowd, your comfort and your respectability guarded at every change in station. To travel alone, unescorted, mixing freely with strangers, was for a respectable woman difficult, faintly dangerous, and often simply not done. Here's a mainstream fact. The railways transformed this century, knitting the country together and making travel possible on a scale never seen before. And they were used by women as well as men. But the experience was shaped by class and by sex at every turn. The wealthy traveled in private comfort, ladies were shielded, accompanied, and provided for. And the freedom of the open road, the freedom simply to go alone wherever one wished, remained far more a man's freedom than a woman's. Here's a quirky tidbit. The anxieties of the age followed women even onto the train. There was real public worry about respectable women sharing railway compartments with unknown men. And various solutions were proposed and sometimes provided, including carriages reserved for ladies. The very newness of the railway, strangers of all sorts thrown together, rushing through the dark at unimaginable speed, collided with the old, careful rules about where a lady might be, and with whom, and the rules did their best to climb aboard and come along. Some historians argue that even this liberating technology was for women hedged about and held back, that the railway's great gift of freedom was rationed to them, fenced with chaperones and reserved compartments, and the ever-present concern for reputation. Others suggest the railways genuinely widened women's worlds, carrying them to places, people, and experiences their mothers could never have reached, and that the very anxieties prove how real the new freedom was. The truth probably lies somewhere between. The world was opening, faster than ever before, and you would be carried through it gently, in a sheltered seat, watching the astonishing new landscape rush by behind glass, closer to the wide world than any woman before you, and still, always, kept a little apart from it. Let us go back for a moment to something so ordinary that you have never once had to think about it, for in this world, even that simple comfort was a quiet labor. And one more thing your modern self has wholly taken for granted. There is no turning of a tap to fill a deep warm bath whenever you wish. Water must be heated, below, in the kitchen, and carried up, can after can, flight after flight, by servants, to fill a basin, or a hit bath set before your bedroom fire. So the full, luxurious bath is not a daily thing, but an occasion, an event made possible by someone else's sweat on the back stairs. Between such baths, washing is done at the washstand, the jug and basin, the cool water, the cloth, the careful sectional cleaning of a body that is, for most of the day, sealed away beneath all those layers. Here's a mainstream fact. For much of this century, even in wealthy homes, bathing as we know it was far more difficult and far less frequent than today, dependent entirely on the heating and hauling of water by hand. Standards of cleanliness were rising across the age, and great value was placed on personal daintiness and fresh linen, but achieving it was real work performed by servants, and the gleaming, effortless hygiene of our own time would have seemed to them a kind of miracle. Here's a quirky tidbit. Because full bathing was such an effort, great importance was placed on clean linen, the chemise, the undergarments next to the skin, which could be changed and laundered far more easily than the body could be fully washed. Freshness was performed in part through spotless white linen and the careful use of scent, lavender water and eau de cologne, light and proper, masking and refreshing. To be a clean and dainty lady was, in no small part, to command the endless laundering of cloth. Some historians argue that this, too, reveals the hidden engine of the whole life, that even the cleanliness of the rich rested on the unending, invisible toil of the poor. The laundresses, with their raw red hands, the maids on the stairs with their heavy cans. Others suggest we should simply marvel at how much care and ingenuity went into comfort and health with so few of our conveniences, and honor the real skill of running a clean and wholesome house by hand. The truth probably lies somewhere between. Your freshness was a gift, carried up the stairs in cans of warm water, and you would do well, your modern self, to remember whose arms carried it, and when you sit at last before your glass to be made ready, you would reach by old habit for the little pots and brushes of your own century, and you would have to stop, because here, the highest art of beauty was to appear to use no art at all. Visible paint, rouge, powder laid on thick, anything that announced itself, was, for a respectable woman of this age, faintly scandalous, the mark of the actress, or worse, of the woman who was not quite nice. The ideal was natural, a clear complexion, bright eyes, glossy hair, a fresh and untouched look, as though beauty were simply a gift of virtue and good health rather than anything contrived. And yet, of course, contrivance there was. Only it had to be hidden, subtle, deniable, a great deal of effort poured into seeming to have made no effort whatsoever. Here's a mainstream fact. Obvious cosmetics were largely frowned upon for respectable Victorian women, associated with vanity, deception, and immorality. The prized look was a natural one, and the beauty advice of the day leaned heavily on regimen rather than paint, on diet, on fresh air and early hours, on the care of the skin and hair, on cleanliness, on a kind of moral approach to looks in which goodness and beauty were quietly assumed to go together. Here's a quirky tidbit. This did not mean women did nothing, only that whatever they did was kept secret. There were discreet preparations and home recipes, gentle washes and creams, ways to brighten the cheek or the eye that could be pretended away, the faint flush attributed to health or modesty rather than to any little bottle. The whole performance of effortless natural beauty rested, as so much of this life did, on hidden work and polite pretense. The labor disowned the moment it succeeded. Some historians argue this was one more impossible standard laid upon women, to be beautiful but never seen to try, to be judged endlessly on their looks, while forbidden the open means to improve them, a trap with no honest way through. Others suggest the natural ideal had its own gentleness, freeing women from the mask-like painted faces of earlier ages, and tying beauty to health and care of the self in ways not wholly unkind. The truth probably lies somewhere between. You were to be lovely, and to pretend your loveliness cost you nothing, and so even your own face, in the glass, became one more quiet performance, the art that must never ever look like art. And finally, lift your eyes from the single day to the whole shape of the year. For the life of a lady moved not only by the hours of the clock, but by the great slow seasons of fashionable life. A calendar as fixed and as binding as any rule of the table. There was the season, those bright months when fashionable society gathered in the city, and the round of balls and dinners and parties and presentations reached its glittering height, and the young were displayed and matched, and everyone who mattered was in town. And then the season ended, and society migrated, as it did every year, out to the country houses, to the great estates, for the shooting and the visiting and the long house parties of autumn. Away to the spa towns to take the waters, to the seaside, from house to house in a stately seasonal procession. The rich moved through the year along well-worn paths, and a lady moved with them, packed and unpacked and conveyed, her life shaped by a migration she did not direct. Here's a mainstream fact. Upper-class life followed a recognized social calendar, centered on the London season and the country house autumn and winter, and the movements of fashionable society between town and country were a defining rhythm of the age. Where one was, and when, was itself a statement of status and belonging. To be in the right place in the right season was part of the very fabric of being someone. Here's a quirky tidbit. These migrations were enormous undertakings, especially for the women who, in practice, oversaw them. Whole households packed up and moved, the right clothes and goods sent ahead, the country house opened and aired and staffed. The complex logistics of feeding and housing great parties of guests for days or weeks on end. Behind the leisured ease of the country house weekend lay a mountain of management, much of it resting quietly on the lady of the house and her formidable command of servants and arrangements. Some historians argue this restless ritual movement was one more way the leisured class performed and consumed its wealth, a costly, elaborate dance of display that bound its members and excluded everyone else. Others suggest the seasonal round also gave real shape, variety, and pleasure to lives that might otherwise have grown unbearably still. Country air after city smoke, fresh scenes, gathered friends, the deep human satisfaction of a year with rhythm and return. The truth probably lies somewhere between. The calendar was a cage drawn large across the months, and it was also the music those months were danced to. And whatever else it was, it would carry you in time back home, to this room, to this fire, to this last quiet hour of this single, ordinary, extraordinary day. The long day folds toward its close, and you climb the stairs again, candle in hand, to the one moment that is almost your own. The guests are gone, or the family has dispersed to their rooms, and the great house quiets around you. Your maid is waiting for the last time today to undo what she did this morning. The jewels are unclasped and put away. The pins are drawn from your hair, and it falls loose at last around your shoulders. The gown is unfastened, the layers lifted away one by one, and then at the very end, the corset is unlaced, and you feel the breath come back into the bottom of your lungs, deep and whole, for the first time since dawn. Here's a mainstream fact, and it is a tender one. That unlacing at the end of the day was for countless women a moment of pure physical relief, the body released from its all-day discipline. And it appears again and again in memoirs and letters as one of the small, real pleasures of the night. The same ritual that began the morning's imprisonment ended, gently, in the evening's freedom. The cage was laced on, and the cage was laced off, and in between lay the whole performed and watched and ordered day. Here's a quirky tidbit. Even now, even here, even at the threshold of sleep, you are not entirely alone. A maid is present until the last, and the house is full of others, sleeping and waking, above and below. True solitude, the empty, quiet room with no one in it and nothing required, is something you have not had all day, and will not quite have now. But this is the closest you will come. The candle, the loosened hair, the deep returning breath. The performance, for a few hours, set down. Some historians argue we should remember, even in this gentle moment, how much was denied, that a life measured out in such relentless constraint, however cushioned, was a life of real limitation, and that the women who lived it deserve our clear sight, not only our sympathy. Others suggest we should also grant them their pleasures and their peace, their friendships and their evenings, and their small nightly freedoms, and not flatten rich, complicated lives into one long lament. The truth probably lies somewhere between. The day was a cage. The day was also, in its way, a life, full of small beauties, small mercies, small unlacings at the end. And now at last, the day is truly done. You sit a moment by the dying fire, your hair down, your breath your own again, and you understand, finally and completely, why your modern self could never have lasted here. Not because the life was cruel in any obvious way, but because it asked you, every hour, to be still, to be watched, to be silent, to be small, and to call the cage a blessing. You could not have done it, and yet somehow generations of women did, and found within those narrow walls whole worlds of feeling and friendship and quiet strength. Tonight, as you drift off, let yourself think of them, and let yourself be grateful for the simple, enormous freedom of lying here in the dark, answering to no one at all. And as you lie here now, in the warm dark, with your hair down and your breath your own again, let your mind wander, slow and unhurried, over a few last quiet things about that vanished world. Small thoughts to drift on, as the great house settles into sleep around you. Think first of the sounds of the house at night. With the dinner long over and the candles guttering low, a different quiet settles over everything. Somewhere below, the last of the work is finally done. The fire's banked, the silver counted and locked away, the great doors bolted for the night. The house creaks and ticks as it cools. A clock chimes somewhere far off, marking an hour no one is awake to hear. And over it all lies the deep particular silence of a world without engines, without electric hum, without any of the small machines that murmur through your own nights. A silence older and softer than any you have ever known, broken only by the wind at the window and the settling of old wood. Here's a mainstream fact that gives that silence its shape. The servants who had risen long before you, in the cold dark of the early morning, were the last to rest at night, climbing at last to their plain, narrow rooms, up beneath the roof, the attic floor, far from the warmth and comfort below, cold in winter and stifling in summer. Their day was bounded by yours at both ends, awake before you, asleep after you, their long hours, the hidden frame around your leisure. Only now, in the deep of the night, was the whole household, server and served alike, finally, equally, at rest. Here's a quirky tidbit. In a world before alarm clocks were common, some working people relied on a curious trade, the knocker-up, who went round in the dark before dawn, tapping at bedroom windows with a long pole to wake those who had to rise early. So even sleep itself was woven into a web of small human labors. Someone, somewhere, was always awake to wake the others, the whole city handing the morning along from one pair of tired hands to the next. Some historians argue that the lives of these night and dawn workers were among the hardest of the age, their rest stolen at both ends to keep the comfortable world running smoothly. Others suggest that within the servants' hall there was also warmth, company, belonging, a whole community with its own jokes and loyalties and small comforts. The truth probably lies somewhere between. But tonight at least, let them rest, all of them, the way you are resting. The long day over, the great house dark, every soul beneath its roof, finally, blessedly still. Think, too, of the small and secret treasures a lady kept close. In a drawer of her writing desk, or a little box with a tiny key, there might be the keepsakes of a quiet life. A bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, a pressed flower from some afternoon she never spoke of. A card kept long after the person who left it had gone. In a life so watched, so performed, so hedged about with rules, these little hidden things were among the very few that belonged truly and only to her. A private museum of a heart that was not permitted to say very much aloud. Here's a mainstream fact, and it is a tender one. The people of this age were great keepers of sentimental tokens, and one of the most striking was the keeping of hair, a lock from a loved one, living or dead, woven into jewelry, set behind glass in a brooch or a locket, worn close to the skin. To us it can seem strange, even morbid. To them it was love made into something you could hold, a way of keeping the absent and the lost forever near, in a century when death came often and early. There was, famously, a whole secret language of flowers, in which each bloom carried a meaning, so that a posy could spell out a message that lips were not allowed to speak. Devotion, longing, remembrance, even refusal. A pressed flower in a lady's box, then, might be no mere souvenir, but a word from someone, preserved. A sentence from her own hidden life, kept where no chaperone could read it. Some historians argue that these sentimental keepsakes reveal how starved this buttoned-up world really was for open feeling. That all the emotion forbidden in speech and on the face had to pour itself instead into objects, into ribbons and lockets and pressed petals. Others suggest we should simply honor the depth of feeling itself, the real and tender hearts that beat beneath the stays and the etiquette, loving as fiercely as any age has ever loved. The truth probably lies somewhere between. And somewhere in the dark, in a locked little drawer, a lady's treasures are sleeping too. Think of the view from her window, late at night. Beyond the glass, the city is going to sleep. The gas lamps glow along the streets in soft, hazy pools, one after another into the distance, kindled at dusk by a lamplighter who passed with his long pole and is long since gone home. A last carriage rattles over the cobbles, its lamps swaying, and then the street is empty. Lights go out one by one in the tall houses across the way, until only here and there a single window still glows. Some other soul, perhaps, awake in the dark, as you are. Here's a mainstream fact. This was the great age of gaslight, which spread through the cities of the century and transformed the night as profoundly, in its way, as anything before the electric bulb. Streets that had once been pitch dark and dangerous after sunset now glowed with a soft amber light. Shops and theaters and grand houses blazed where before there had been only candle and shadow. The very rhythm of night and day was loosened. The dark, for the first time in human history, was being pushed gently back. Here's a quirky tidbit. And yet that famous glow mingled, in the great cities, with the equally famous fog, the thick, yellow, choking pea-souper that could roll in and swallow the streets, turning the gas lamps into dim floating halos and muffling the whole world. It is the very image we still carry of the period, the lamplit, fog-wrapped street, beautiful and eerie at once, romantic in memory, though it was in truth the smoke of a million coal fires hanging in the damp air. Some historians argue that this lamplit city was a marvel and a liberation, opening the evening hours to life, safety, and pleasure as never before. Others remind us of its cost, the coal smoke, the foul air, the grime that settled over everything and everyone. The truth probably lies somewhere between. But from a warm bedroom window, high above the quiet street, the city falling asleep beneath its hazy lamps is a gentle thing to watch. 1,000 small lights, flickering slowly out toward the dark. Think of how the seasons turned, and how many days like this one made up a whole life. Spring brought the city back to life, and the season with it, the round of parties beginning again. Summer ripened and faded, and society drifted to the country, to the long golden weeks among the trees. Autumn came with its house parties and misted mornings, the smell of wood smoke and turning leaves. And winter closed the year in early dark and firelight, in the deep hush of snow against the windows. Round and round the seasons went, year upon year, and a woman measured out her life inside them. For a young lady, time itself was strangely urgent, for the window in which she was expected to marry was narrow. Only a few short seasons after coming out into society, when she was at her freshest and most sought after. A girl might have just a handful of springs in which to find her match, and the years were counted, quietly and not always kindly, by everyone around her. Here's a quirky tidbit with a melancholy edge. A woman who passed those few seasons unmarried risked being thought, in the cruel phrase of the day, on the shelf, her best chance behind her, her future narrowing toward a long life as a dependent aunt or companion in other people's homes. The same calendar that glittered for the young debutante pressed down, year by year, on the woman it had passed by. Some historians argue this made a young woman's life a race against a cruelly short clock, her whole worth tied to a few fleeting springs. Others suggest that many women found rich and meaningful lives outside or beyond marriage too, as the century slowly opened, and that we should not measure their happiness only by the altar. The truth probably lies somewhere between. So many springs, so many winters, a whole life turning with the seasons, made of days much like this one. And think, last of all, of the women themselves, the real ones, who truly live these days, and whose names, for the most part, the world has long since forgotten. For all the duchesses and great hostesses whose portraits survive, there were thousands upon thousands of ordinary ladies whose lives left scarcely a trace. A line in a parish register, a faded photograph, a sampler stitched in childhood, a few letters kept and then lost. They lived and felt and hoped and grew old and slipped quietly out of memory, as nearly everyone who has ever lived eventually does. Here's a mainstream fact. So much of what we know of these women's inner lives comes from the diaries and letters that happened by chance to survive. The private writings in which, away from the watching eyes of the drawing room, they finally said what they truly felt. It is in these quiet pages that the real women step forward at last, funny, longing, clever, frustrated, tender, fully human, nothing like the still and silent figures the rules tried to make of them. Here's a quirky tidbit. Many kept these diaries faithfully all their lives, in little locked books, confiding to the page what they could tell no living soul. And it is only because a few of those books escaped the fire and were tucked away in an attic and found again long after that we can hear those voices at all. Whole inner worlds were saved or lost on such tiny accidents of survival. Some historians argue that we can never truly know these women, separated from us as they are by so much silence and so many lost pages. Others suggest that across the years, their voices still reach us, clear and near, whenever we trouble to listen. The truth probably lies somewhere between, but tonight, as you lie here in the dark, you are listening. And that, perhaps, is its own small kindness across the centuries. Let yourself feel the thread that connects you to all of them, faint and warm, a line of quiet women stretching back and back through the years, each one lying down at the end of her day, just as you are lying down now. Think, while the warmth still holds you, of the fire. For in that world, heat was a precious and a local thing, gathered close around the hearth, with the cold pressing in just beyond it. The coal fire was the heart of every room that had one, and a great house was a patchwork of warm pools and chilly distances. The drawing room glowing, the corridors cold, the bedrooms reached through drafts, the far reaches of the house frankly freezing in winter. To be warm was to be near the fire. To cross the room was, often, to feel the chill reach for you again. Here's a mainstream fact. Keeping these countless fires burning was an enormous and unending labor, almost all of it invisible. Coal had to be hauled, scuttle by scuttle, to every grate, ashes raked and carried away, fires laid, lit, tended, and banked, room after room, day after day, by housemaids whose blackened hands and early hours paid for the family's warmth. The cozy glow you are imagining rested, like so much else, on someone else's cold and sooty toil. Here's a quirky tidbit. To brave the icy bed at the far end of a winter's night, there was a small and homely magic. The warming pan, a covered metal pan filled with embers, and run between the cold sheets before you climbed in, or later, the stone or rubber bottle filled with hot water and tucked beneath the covers. A maid might slip one into your bed while you sat at the fire, so that the chill was chased from the linen before your warm body ever met it. A small, kind labor, performed quietly, so that you need never feel the cold at all. Some historians argue that this constant battle with cold and damp shaped the whole texture of life in ways we, in our evenly heated rooms, can scarcely imagine. That to be warm was a luxury unevenly shared, and the poor and the servants knew far more of the cold than of the fire. Others remind us of the deep, simple pleasure of the hearth itself, the gathering of a family into its circle of light and warmth, one of the oldest comforts of our kind. The truth probably lies somewhere between. But tonight your bed is warm, the chill is held at bay, and you may sink into the heat of it without a single thought of the cold beyond. And think, as your eyes grow heavy, of sleep and dreams themselves, and what that long-ago world made of them. For the people of this age were great wonderers about the night mind, about what dreams meant, what they foretold, what messages might come drifting up out of the dark. In an era still close to older beliefs, a dream might be read as an omen, a warning, a glimpse of things to come, and many a lady would wake and turn the night's strange visions over in her mind, wondering what they meant. Here's a mainstream fact. Sleep in that world was, for most, a different and often more broken thing than ours. Before bright artificial light flooded the evening, people kept closer to the rhythms of darkness, going to bed earlier, and some, it seems, slept in two stretches across the night, waking for a quiet hour in the small hours before sleeping again. Unbroken 8 hours we aim for may be more a creature of our lit-up age than a timeless human pattern. Here's a quirky tidbit. There was a brisk trade in little dream books which claimed to interpret the meaning of everything one might dream. To dream of water meant this, of a death meant that, of a wedding something else again. People consulted them as half game, half belief, and a servant girl and her mistress alike might puzzle over the same small volume, trying to read the future in the debris of the night. The mind asleep was a country everyone visited and no one understood, and they filled its maps, as we still do, with hope and superstition and longing. Some historians argue these beliefs reveal a world still half enchanted, reaching for meaning in the dark, in ways the coming century of science would slowly explain away. Others suggest the mystery of sleep and dreams is one we have never truly solved, and that they wondered at it, rightly, much as we still do. The truth probably lies somewhere between. But you need not solve it tonight. You need only let it take you. So let the wondering go, and the dreaming come. and follow it gently down. So let the great house go quiet now. Let the candles burn low, one by one, all down the long corridors, until only the dark is left, soft and complete. Sleep approaches slowly, softly, like a tide coming in. There is nothing more to do tonight. No card to leave, no caller to receive, no rule to remember, no eyes to perform for. The day is over, and its thousand small demands have all let go of you at last. You can feel them loosening, like the laces drawn from the stays, one by one, until your whole body breathes easy and deep. Notice that breath now. Let it slow. Let it sink lower, all the way down, the deep and easy breath that the day never allowed. Breathe in gently, and let the warm air fill you. And breathe out slowly, and feel your shoulders drop, and your jaw soften, and the small muscles around your eyes go still. There is no mask to hold up now. No one is watching. You can let your face be exactly as it is. Let your shoulders sink deeper into the pillow. Let the weight of your arms grow heavy, and your hands fall open, and your fingers uncurl. Feel how the bed holds you completely, asking nothing in return. You do not have to sit straight. You do not have to be still for anyone, or pleasant for anyone, or anything at all. You belong to no one tonight. You belong only to sleep. Your body feels calm now. Your mind feels calm. Everything feels calm, and safe, and still. The room is warm, the dark is kind, and there is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do, and no one you need to be, except exactly who you are, here, now, sinking softly into rest. Let the images of the day fade now. Let the great house dim and soften and slip away. The morning room, the carriage, the candlelit table, the ballroom with its turning dancers, let them grow faint, like a painting seen through gauze. Just colors now, just warmth, just the faint and fading echo of a world long gone. There is no need to hold any of it. Let it all drift off, the way the light drifts off the floor at the end of an afternoon, slowly and then completely. Breathe in once more, slow and deep, and breathe out, and let yourself go a little heavier, a little softer, a little further down. With every breath you sink a little deeper into the warm and quiet dark. Sleep is so close now. It is gathering around you like a soft tide, rising gently, carrying you out and down, away from the day, away from the year, away from every rule and watcher and clock, into the deep still water where no one is watching and nothing is required, and you are wholly, perfectly free. You have nowhere to be but here. Let the last candle go out. Let the house fall dark. Let yourself drift down and down into dreams where no one is watching at all. Sleep well. Sweet dreams.